All right, it's that time on a Sunday morning as we pick up a book from the shelf and analyze it with the help of eNCA book club members. Today we focus on Unlikely Mr. Rogue, A Life with Ivan Pillay by Evelyn Groenink. Let's have a chat now about the book with Rofhiwa, Madzena and Heidi Giokos. Thank you very much, ladies, once again for joining me. Of course, when you read the book, you realize that it's basically Ivan Pillay and the author's response, the author being his wife, their response to those allegations that surfaced through the media for a couple of months, 2 years actually, about the SARS rogue unit and the allegations that Ivan Pillay, along with the now Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, being part of a rogue unit that was spying on taxpayers.
Yes, certainly. Masego, I'm not sure if I can go first, but I'll just start off with, I want to actually lift the book up and show you how thick the book actually is, and how I would admit that it was quite a difficult read. It's quite a complex matter, and speaking from a point where I covered the Nugent Commission of Inquiry about 2 years ago, where the rogue unit was a very sharp focus and point in that commission, where the commission was trying to figure out whether or not there was indeed a rogue unit. And of course, Ivan Pillay, who was the Deputy SARS Commissioner many years back, testified at this commission. And this book, I must say, is quite a complex one. You have to really dig deep into it to try and understand what exactly is going on, and also because it's written from his wife's point of view, who's also an investigative journalist. But basically, this book speaks about how Ivan Pillay, who came from the struggle times and was appointed to work at SARS and to try and build SARS to be the gem of this country and be an institution that other countries would look up to as it focused on taxpayers and collecting revenue. And then it emerged that there was the so-called rogue unit, and that's why people actually call it the so-called rogue unit, because there was very little evidence. But basically what the rogue unit did was people alleged that the likes of Ivan Pillay, Johan van Lochenberg and other top SARS officials, including the Minister Pravin Gordhan, were trying to overturn the president at the time, which was President Jacob Zuma, and spy on top officials in government and their tax affairs. Of course, when Ivan Pillay testified, you can see he's a very quiet and very introvert, if I can put it that way. And this book speaks about how he had to swim with the crocodiles, how he was forced to fire and hire certain individuals, all depending on what the mandate was given to SARS at the time. And if you hadn't really covered the Nugent Commission or followed the Nugent Commission, I must say that this book was a little bit difficult to follow, and it took me a very long time to actually finish because of its complexity and trying to understand exactly what SARS was all about and how complex that institution was and how a rogue unit could even be formed under top officials within government.
I think it took Heidi, Rofhiwa and I about 3 months to finish the book. We kept postponing the day that we actually eventually review it, and you're right. It's because it's so complex and complicated, and even as journalists ourselves, we read about these articles. You covered the Nugent inquiry, but it doesn't mean that you'll understand everything that's written in the book. But let's listen to an interview that Ivan Pillay actually did on eNCA with Karima Brown back in November. Perfect day to actually review this book and play this interview by Karima, where he explains in his own words, what it meant to work for SARS. Here it is.
The very first thing I think that we got right is that each one of us had a purpose in our lives. And we found a purpose in SARS. Minister Gordhan talks about a higher purpose. Many of us, not all of us, but many of us that come from the liberation movement, from the liberation struggle, we were quite determined to succeed. We knew that a democratic government would need funding to make its programs achievable. And that is what drove us. Now, the purpose is, of course, not just enunciated or written on a piece of paper. It informs the criteria for recruitment of people. It informs the way you do your work. It informs quite naturally that you would be very sensitive to the taxpayers' feelings and the responses of taxpayers. It also talks to the fact that although you have to enforce certain things, you will be fair in what you do.
Yeah.
So this thing permeates the institution.
Right, there was a snippet of an interview we were playing there for you when the Fix presenter, Karima Brown, was speaking to Ivan Pillay here on eNCA last November about his role at SARS. Now, Rofhiwa, I'm going to bring you in. You know, this book is also complex because it has a lot of history in it, right? It talks about Pillay's position in the struggle for freedom, his role in Operation Vula, which was an underground operation to fight against the apartheid regime, and how he and his wife actually met. So that's where it basically starts, I think, in 1989. But it also goes back to the book and its title, because it talks about the kind of person Pillay was. And I think, Heidi, you touched on it a little bit, a quiet man, really.
Right, Masego, and it's really, really interesting how his wife writes about him. And there are points in the imaging chapter, for example, where you could feel her frustration at his quiet nature. They would have conversations, and she says, you know, he always wanted to know a lot, but would never say anything. And there was a time for Valentine's Day, for example, when he called and they exchanged one-word answers. And then he just says to her, I just called you because it's Valentine's Day. So that didn't take away from the love that they had for each other. It just shows what a quiet man it was. So another thing that kind of shows you about his character, apart from being quiet, he's a very orderly man. He likes to follow the law. He likes to make sure that things are done in an orderly and correct manner. And that comes through in terms of how he tried to deal with this whole rogue unit. And that's why she probably titled the book The Unlikely Mr. Rogue, because his character does not match a rogue person, someone who's going to be coloring out the lines. In fact, he had this quiet demeanor, but he also had a really strong character. And she quotes it quite a couple of times in the book where she says, that you will always do what Ivan asks you to do. And he would never raise his voice or talk to you in a disrespectful manner, but just the character that he had gave him that kind of respect that he would need when things needed to be done. So it was very interesting to read about the kind of man he was. And I actually think, I'm smiling now as I talk about it, because I really enjoyed learning about Ivan the person, not the person that was in politics, who was in underground, who was part of Operation Vula, but just that quiet man who still got things done. So basically that's what I got from that. And also just to reflect on what Heidi said, is that this whole rogue unit that was established by these forces was an intentional hollowing out of the SARS institution. Getting people that aren't qualified, getting rid of skills so that things could be moved around and things could be done without any form of accountability or evidence to show that illegal happenings were going on at the institution. And I think that's what, I watched an interview with his wife earlier on, and she said what affected them most about him being called rogue was not a personal thing on him, was that all the work that they had done over the years to ensure the integrity of the institution was hollowed out in a short space of time, and he and his team were used as scapegoats.
What I also found interesting in the book is how they met. They basically met because of the fact that they had one cause, right? Ivan Pillay was trying to actually have people fight against the apartheid regime, and she was an investigative journalist that he called to write the stories of people who had gone into exile and were trying to come back into South Africa. And they knew that the apartheid government was going to be toppled, and that Nelson Mandela, for instance, would be released, and the other ANC leaders at the time. But they were too afraid to come back home, and she was talking about having to cover those stories and him giving her access to those comrades to be able to speak to them. But going back to the point about the kind of man he was, the description in this book about the kind of man he was and not wanting to step out of the rule. Let's play another part of that interview that Karima Brown did unit with Ivan Pillay last year, where he talks about civil servants and what they are, the lines that they're actually supposed to follow.
I'll start by saying that we have a very fragmented public service. We've got 3 spheres of government, and the 3 spheres are not connected through one public service. When you join an institution like, let's take Home Affairs, you generally stay in Home Affairs till you finish there or you get kicked out or whatever. Normally in state institutions, you join one institution, you'll spend a few years and then you'll move around. You get a government-wide experience. You also build up your own network of public servants with who you exchange things and so on. So what happens now is you're just into one institution. Okay. So that builds a pressure within the institution to promote people. And sometimes people get promoted beyond their capability. Okay. So we don't manage the public service as a whole. We don't have career management of the public service as a whole.
That was, of course, Ivan Pillay speaking to Karima Brown about what he thinks should happen in terms of public servants and the kind of training that they should go through to be able to uphold, let's say, their positions as public servants and serve the people. But I want to go back, Heidi, to what Rofhiwa is saying, specifically about, the allegations that were doing the rounds about the rogue unit and Ivan Pillay, Johan van Logerenberg and Minister Pravin Gordhan, those allegations that were made against them, which we obviously found out later on were not true. She talks a little bit about what they were going through, and Rofhiwa touched on it a little bit, going through the fact that SARS was something that the 3 had actually built, and they were invited to international stages to talk about how well SARS was doing, and for this to dismantle all of that work.
Most certainly, and I think that was something that was definitely highlighted when Ivan Pillay actually testified at the Commission of Inquiry, and how he basically explained that they worked so hard to build that institution up to make sure that at least the revenue collector was operating the best way that it could. They had the best skills in there. And he also goes on to explain how, it was an institution that was that they took over back in 1994, and he explains how it was a difficult time. And then he explains when Zuma became president and how he was basically told what to do, who to hire, when to hire. And there was something interesting in that interview that he actually did with Karima Brown, and he explains how we need to be loyal to the Constitution and not to political parties, not to factions, not to politicians and not to individuals, but to the Constitution. What does the Constitution say that we need to do in terms of making sure that the revenue collector does what it's supposed to do? And the whole smear campaign, that's what they described it as a smear campaign, trying to attack individuals. And that's why the book is basically called The Unlikely Mr. Rogue, because Ivan Pillay was not anything like that. He was told what to do. He went on a straight line. He stuck to the Constitution and to the policies of the Revenue Service, and he was attacked and told that he was part of a rogue unit and trying to overturn the president at the time and attack certain politicians.
Rofhiwa, I'm going to give you some time very quickly to tell me what you thought about the book. Obviously, there was a lot that was said in the newspapers about this rogue unit that people probably still believe today. A lot of damage was done. And I think this book was basically their way, Ivan Pillay and his wife's way, to respond and have their own version of the story. How did you find the book?
Apart from the difficulty of actually reading the book, because it is so complex and it's so intense, it was a combination of a love story. It was Pillay's journey as being a struggle person. We also go through a little bit of his childhood. So it was an all-encompassing book that really introduces you or reintroduces you to Ivan Pillay outside of the newspaper headlines, outside of the smear campaigns that we have been privy to over the years. So it was very interesting in that sense. And it was also very interesting and very comforting for Evelyn to let us into her life, for us to understand the difficulties and the complexities that they went through, not only as a couple, she as an investigative journalist and him as someone who's in politics, right? He's also had to sit through and watch what happened in terms of the decimation of SARS and subsequently trying to rebuild it. The problem now, I think he sits back, and those that were involved sit back and they think, how is this institution ever going to be rebuilt to contribute significantly to South Africa's economy again? And what we're seeing now with all the state capture revelations and all the issues that are faced by the current commissioner, we don't know when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen, that it will be returned to his former glory. So I think they sit back and they feel disappointed that some of their efforts maybe were in vain just because of what's happened in recent times. And that's kind of what the book highlights. It's a love story. It's a story about Ivan. It's a story about the struggle. It's a story about state capture and really what not following the Constitution will do to the country.
All right, thank you very much once again, eNCA Book Club members Rofhiwa, Madzena and Heidi Giokos, for your time. It's The Unlikely Mr. Rogue by Evelyn Groenink. She talks about a life with Ivan Pillay.